Letty Cottin Pogrebin, a writer, activist, and national lecturer, is the founding editor of Ms. Magazine and the author of 12 books. Her works include the Jewish feminist classic, Deborah, Golda, and Me, Being Female and Jewish in America, the novel, Single Jewish Male Seeking Soulmate, and her latest title, Shanda, a memoir of shame and secrecy. She was also the editorial consultant of Marlo Thomas's acclaimed children's book, Free to Be You and Me. Ms. Pogrebin's articles have appeared in the New York Times, The Nation, Washington Post, Huffington Post, Tablet, The Forward, and many other periodicals of Jewish interest. She is a co-founder of the National Women's Political Caucus and the UJA Task Force on Women and the Ms. Foundation for Women, and is past president of Authors Guild and of Americans for Peace Now. She currently serves on the board of Brandeis University's Women's and Gender Studies program and performed past board service for the Women's Studies in Religion program and at the Harvard Divinity School. Ms. Pogrebin's honors include a Yale University Poynter Fellowship in Journalism, a Matrix Award for Excellence in Communication and the Arts, and an Emmy Award for her work on Free to Be You and Me. Her writing and activism have also been honored by dozens of Jewish organizations and synagogues. Letty Cottin Pogrebin lives with her husband in New York City and Stockbridge, Massachusetts. The couple has 3 children and 6 grandchildren.
Hi there, welcome, Letty.
Hi, good to see you, Shelley.
Good to see you too. Just a little housekeeping to start with. To our live audience, if you have any questions for Letty, please write them on a note card on the table and give it to Stephanie Greenfield. And for the virtual audience, you can type in your question in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And as a reminder, Copper Dog Books is here and they are selling pre-signed books in person, or you can go to Copper Dog Books online to order a pre-signed copy. First of all, it's such an honor to meet you.
Oh,
Your book is just so open and so brave, confessional, and unblinkingly honest. And it's also, and here I have my prop, which has been by my bedside these last few days. This book is not just a memoir, I don't think. It's a meticulously researched blend of so many genres, including memoir, but also social history, anthropology, feminism, theology, and let you add the spice of a novelistic adventure as well. So don't, it's not just a memoir. And somehow you managed to pepper the book with nuggets of proof texts that are just the right size and frequency. So they enrich rather than distract or bog down the book. So thank you for that too.
thank you for that. I'd like to take you with me wherever I go. I love that introduction. Thank you.
And that's only half of it. I thought I was too gushy with the other half. We'll see if we have time. I'll send you an email. So the first question, just to kind of ground us a little bit, especially those who haven't read the book, but who I'm sure will after this presentation, could you define Shanda for us in the way in which you mean it, and explain how this word, this idea became the framework for your memoir?
Yeah, most people who are at this event probably have heard or said it's a Shanda at some point in their lives, because at this point, the Yiddish word, which means shame or disgrace, has actually appeared in secular settings and in newspapers and in columns written by Irish Catholics like Peggy Noonan. Somebody stood up at the Brett Kavanaugh hearing in the balcony and shouted, "This is a Shanda." So, and it's been in headlines in the Daily News and in Time magazine. So people who aren't Jewish even know what a Shanda is, the way they know what chutzpah means. It became the obvious title for my book when I was writing a kind of a traditional memoir, chronological. I'm 83. I was coming up on 80. It was 5 years ago. I had figured I had 2 years to write a book that makes sense of my life. And I started, early on, and I was working my way through it. And then, since you read the book, my granddaughter was assigned to write a biography in her college English class. The professor was a very well-known biographer of military figures and statesmen. My granddaughter had to, as everyone else in the class did, had to clear with him who her subject was going to be. And she said, I want to write about my grandma. And he kind of smirked because people don't have that kind of view of grandmas that they're worthy of writing biographies of if the person is a military historian and a kind of old style patriarch type. So he said, oh, that's very nice, Molly, but who's your grandma? And she showed him my Google page. she Googled me. And he said, okay, you can write it. So Molly went off to my archive at Smith College. She read everything she could get her hands on, all my books, all my articles. And then, I don't know why my printer is making noise, but I'm turning it off. And then she asked me if she could come to my study, which is right here. And as you can see, it's full of books, and you can't see it, but it's got shelves full of file cabinets. And she went through everything. Then she said, where's the stuff about your childhood? And I said, oh, I stick that underneath this cabinet. I haven't looked in it for years. She opens it up. She takes out my teenage diaries. I don't know about you, but I kept teenage diaries under lock and key, little leather volumes under lock and key. She tears it open. She starts reading. She said, this is great. Where's other stuff? And I sort of got down and on my hands and knees, and I looked deep into this very, very deep cabinet. And I pulled out a huge shopping bag full of old paper, old documents, old letters. And I remembered where I got it. It was something my sister had kept, which she had found in my mother's closet when our mother died in 1955. And she had added to it. It was, I upended it on my dining room table, and it was full of letters, very private letters between my parents, hundreds of them, letters my sister had written, other members of our family, documents, divorce papers, things I had no idea existed. And that's when I said, look at how many Shandas we have had in our family, the things that my parents were embarrassed by. They were an immigrant, they were part of an immigrant generation that was desperate to be accepted, believed in the melting pot, that they should acclimate and assimilate and be as close to real Americans as they could. And that meant hiding their imperfections, hiding divorces, hiding abandoned children, hiding homosexuals, hiding even illness, the C word. So I was privy suddenly to a history that I had no idea about. I found out a lot about my parents that I never knew and would never have known. And, it left me with a feeling of sort of pity for future generations who won't have that. They're going to have to comb through emails that say things like LMK, which means let me know. I had no idea that meant let me know, but I got it in so many emails. I asked a teenager what it meant. Anyway, that's the story of why that title became sort of a compulsory headline for me.
And I can't help but think, and I wonder if you thought this too, what if your mother hadn't saved those letters?
It would have been a much more ordinary book.
Yeah, what if Betty hadn't given them to you before she died? And
Right.
what if your granddaughter hadn't taken that specific course?
Yes, exactly. That's why I really feel that my life is manipulated by the great puppeteer in the sky, because all those things did happen at the perfect moment for me.
Yeah. It's hard to read Shanda and not think about how different today's world is from that of our own childhoods, let alone our parents and our grandparents. Privacy seems to have been replaced with compulsive sharing, shaming, with canceling. Do young people, and you have mentioned Israelis, so I bring that up also as an entree for you. But do young people even have the capacity today, in your opinion, to feel shame that correlates to what you describe in the book? And is that itself a shame? In other words, is there a positive role that Shanda plays?
Oh, I think so for sure. I say at the end of the book, and you know this, Shelley, I say I wish people a secret-free life, because secrets are so burdensome, so heavy, so corrosive. But I don't wish people a shame-free life. And you raise Israel. I worry about Israel because there's so many indicators, social indicators, that suggest a kind of shamelessness, about Netanyahu cozying up to Viktor Orban, a dictator in Hungary, or Bolsonaro, who was in where was he? Brazil, and what's his name in the Philippines. It was shameful that a Jewish leader would ignore the anti-Semitism of these men for other kinds of motivations and aims that seem to me to have lost a lot of the Jewish soul. As far as kids are concerned now, they're certainly capable of feeling shamed because witness the fear of being canceled. The Shanda operated the way canceling does today, because rumors and gossip in a Jewish community were deadly. They were deadly. People feared being found out for the simplest things, if a mentally ill child was known, then the family couldn't make a shidduch, couldn't make a match, perhaps with other families who wouldn't want to have mental illness in their genes, So the sort of impact of Shanda was comparable to the impact of the canceling now, but the material is so very different. It isn't, it's the sort of thing back then that we would laugh at now. Being ashamed that you were the one who changed your family name, not the customs officer. We blamed it on the customs officer because we didn't want to admit that we were kowtowing to the Gentiles, and we were afraid of anti-Semitism, and we changed our names to fit in, and we gave up our history and our legacy in changing our names. And there are people in my generation and my children's generation who are angry at our forebears for giving up that identity, because it had a long history. But Jews did what they had to do. Hiding was our legacy. We hid, and we learned how to hide from our sacred texts, because it's as basic as God's hiding God's face from Moses, or Leah being hidden under the bridal veil. So Jacob, had to wait 7 more years to marry Rachel. Esther hiding in the king's court. No, didn't know they were a Jew. She was a Jew at first. King David hiding that he sent his Bathsheba's wife out to be killed in battle because he was enamored of her and he wanted to be able to have her. All of those secrets one can deplore them, or one can admire the fact that secrets saved us. Secrets were a survival strategy for much of Jewish history, certainly in the Holocaust, certainly in the Inquisition, and certainly we're supposed to learn from the Torah that there are utilitarian secrets and utilitarian lies.
Switching gears a little bit, your chapter titles are fabulous, and there are 52 of them. So there's a lot of creativity in that. They're pithy, they're pointed, and they're often hilarious. Chapter 13, for example, is titled "Our Kitchen Was Kosher, Our Stomachs Cheated." And yet that it's a short chapter, but the story turns serious with serious implications that led you away from organized Judaism and towards feminism. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, that chapter starts with the cheating that went on, transgressions of Judaism. We were high conservative. My parents were raised Orthodox, and they sort of softened the edges in the United States, again, to fit in. But they did keep a kosher home. My mother was strictly kosher. My grandparents wouldn't have eaten in the house otherwise. But we ate out on Sunday nights. We went for Southern fried chicken that came with macaroni and cheese. And we went to a seafood restaurant in Brooklyn called Lundy's. And we went to Chinese restaurants on Sunday nights. And my father, who was a very scholarly Jew, as well as being a lawyer, unusual for a Jew in 1923 to have become a lawyer, but he had taught Hebrew school in order to get through college and law school. He was a Baal Koreh. He could read from the Torah. He knew the cantillation like Frank Sinatra knew Nelson Riddle. And for him to cheat on Judaism in ways that were sort of astounding. For instance, he would smoke on Shabbat, even though he knew perfectly well that, it wasn't Jewishly legal. It wasn't halachic to smoke on Shabbat, but he was a two-pack a day guy, and he did. He just put out his cigarette 5 blocks away from shul. He drove on Shabbat and parked the car 5 blocks from shul. So I saw hypocrisy. Then what you're referring to is the time that my father did not bend the rules, and that was for me. He bent the rules for himself, bent the rules for the kosher kitchen. But when my mother died, I was 15, and I was not allowed to count in the minyan at the shiva because girls didn't count. Women weren't counted in the making of a minyan, the 10-man quorum required for public prayer. And I said to my father, "You have to count me in, Daddy." He had educated me. I went to Hebrew school, Hebrew high school. I graduated 2 years at the Yeshiva of Central Queens, and I became a bat mitzvah, one of the first in conservative Judaism. I said, "How can you count me out? I'm a daughter of the commandments, and this is my mother." And he said, "Asur, it's forbidden." And I never quite got over that. There are a couple of things I have never quite gotten over in my life with my parents. That was one. And I left Judaism counting myself out. If he would count me out, he representing patriarchal Judaism, real Judaism, if he would count me out, I would count myself out. And I left the fold for 15 years. During those 15 years, I married a Jew, but he was a Yiddishist, progressive, super progressive, i.e. communist, red diaper baby type progressive, who didn't go to shul and wasn't bar mitzvahed. So it was up to me how much Judaism my children would learn. And I did not choose to educate them, because why educate them if they're going to bump up against this sort of exclusionary pain? My son as well, I didn't want him to experience the second-class nature of the Judaism's treatment of women. So that my father's exclusion of me really affected our whole family, and women's frustration with being left out affects children and grandchildren. And you lose a lot when you lose a woman.
Really do. Well, you're well known as the co-founder of Ms. Magazine and a tireless advocate and activist for women's rights. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the feminist implications of Shanda. One story that you've told that I love is that just the way your grandmother as the runaway bride can be looked at in two different ways, depending on the context and the time.
Right. Yes. I discovered, again, very much as an adult, by accident, the Shanda, that my grandmother was a runaway bride. If you imagine Fiddler on the Roof, my grandmother was like, say, what was it, Sadel? Title. I think she was the one who was betrothed to the tailor,
The
right?
Red Razor Wolf. Or
Yes, Laser Wolf. My grandmother was betrothed to Laser Wolf and loved my grandfather, the man became my grandfather, who was her tailor, metal tailor. And she tied together all the bed sheets. They had a ceremony. She tied together the bed sheets for the bridal chamber, and she dropped out the window of this little inn in the shtetl in Hungary and ran away to my grandfather. Now, I never knew that. I'm one of 12 cousins on each side of my family. So there are 24 cousins. There were 7 siblings on each side of my family and their spouses. Big, big extended family. Never knew this. When I learned it, I thought to myself how differently we would have viewed this little old woman who was always, with an apron welded to her waist, and what I call a unibosom, that just, she had a body that just went down, like a valley. And she was a woman who cooked, a woman who put her false teeth in a glass of water at night, a woman who ate Wonder Bread chopped up, in a hot glass, in a bowl of hot milk. That's who I knew, and I didn't know her at all. If I had known, as I say in the book, that under her crocheted shawl there was a Wonder Woman cape, she would have modeled a different kind of female to me and my cousins. Instead, we saw a supplicant, we saw a quiet, submissive, self-abnegating presence, someone who was totally overshadowed by my grandfather. And that was our model of womanhood. And then our mothers were very similar in that way. So we missed 2 generations worth. I write about my abortions and how I couldn't tell anybody, and I was going to kill myself. I was about to graduate from Brandeis, and I could not visit upon my family the Shanda of an illegitimate child. So I was going to jump off the Whitestone Bridge or the Triborough Bridge or in front of the E train, which went to Jamaica where I lived. That was going to be it for me. And had I known, which I found out way later, long after my mother was gone, that the sister I wouldn't go to because she was so perfect, I thought, and so upright. The mother who had died by then, but I certainly would not have gone to. That even my grandmother, they'd all had abortions. Nobody talked about it because it was a Shanda. And so, in the sense of kind of women's continuum, there were no connections that one could draw on. It was illegal. It was a Shanda. There was nobody I could talk to, and I was going to have to die until my roommate more or less saved me, dragged me to the dorm counselor, who was a very no-nonsense. She was also the fencing coach at Brandeis. Very no-nonsense woman, just took things on matter-of-factly. She connected me to the abortion underground that existed all over this country. Who knew at that time? This was 1959. And I was lucky enough to get to a saintly doctor, a full-fledged physician who ran a clinic because he believed women's lives had to be saved. Too many women were dying of self-inflicted lie and hangers and jumping off down stairways. Women were dying, and this man was the person who allowed me to have a life, really.
Well, and you know, following up on that, as a leader in the movement that got Roe v. Wade passed, you know, what are your thoughts on the current climate, and how can we avoid going back to those times of our grandmothers and mothers and sisters and ourselves, when abortion was a Shanda at the very least, and illegal and criminal at the very worst?
Yes, and now the criminalization of doctors and the kind of vigilante legal obligation of people to report their neighbors, and people's computers being invaded, so you find out where they're ordering pills from. This is all, you know, Handmaid's Tale territory. And we're back there because I don't remember how many, but so many states have already outlawed abortion. And I think we have something like 13 states that have guaranteed access to abortion. And our strategy now has to be multifaceted. We have to, first and foremost, in my opinion, we have to have a state strategy, and that is to take state elections and local elections seriously, the way right-wing people have done for many years now. We couldn't imagine rights being taken away, so we didn't take seriously the threat. We thought we were secure. I mean, what Supreme Court decision takes rights away from people, from a class of people? This was a shock, really, and we were unprepared. Young people have taken it for granted for 50 years. You know, people have taken for granted what for me was almost a reason for suicide. And they didn't realize that, you know, liberation has to be fought for and fought for again and renewed, and you never stop. When I was at Ms. in 1972, and all sorts of legislation was being passed and litigation was successful and women were out in the streets, we were having consciousness raising groups, and politicians suddenly were, you know, addressing our needs and understanding that women's issues had to be forefronted on the party platforms. All of that was happening. I said to myself, you know, this should be over in about 1975. We should be done. And, you know, threw myself into it with that sense that young people have, that progress moves forward. Not that you get it and then you lose it. Not that it happens and then it slides all the way back down the hill. But when, you know, we thought we were moving in that direction, Reagan was elected, and suddenly Phyllis Schlafly was everywhere, and the Equal Rights Amendment was ridiculed and didn't pass the efforts to ratify. So we started going downhill, and again, our side, when I say our side, I think people who think women are human beings and need to be treated with dignity and equality. We just kind of watched it happen. Some of us fought, but not hard enough.
Yeah, I think it shows that we just can't take anything for granted.
Absolutely not.
So you write that you inherited your fears and superstitions from your mother, and I'm assuming that there is a physical part that goes to the poo Kanahara. You do the, I assume.
Oh yeah.
As well. Yeah. Okay.
It was very hard to write that on the page.
But you did a good job. That's why I wanted to double check, because maybe there was a part that I didn't know that didn't have that piece.
No, I don't have the finger part that you just did.
Ah,
Yeah.
okay. Well, we'll talk.
I have plenty of superstitions and
Well, and that's what I was gonna, and you know, the theme of the evil eye runs through Shanda. So I wanted to hear more about some other superstitions, and also why you're stopping, if it's true, at 12 books. I understand that has a little piece of the superstition in it.
yes, right. 13 is a little problematic. You never I've had dinner parties for 12 and then somebody will come into town and say, you have room at your table? I know, I really don't. You don't want to jinx my table. Yeah, put it this way. My mother was an uneducated woman, came here when she was either 7, 8, or 9. Since she lied, it's very hard to know how old she really was. That was part of the hiddenness in my family. And the lies all had a reason. They all had a reason. They all were important. And I've come to respect, again, the need to hide things that were so debilitating for my mother in particular. In any case, so when you have an 8th grade education and you come from a shtetl, a little shtetl called Pilipits in Hungary, I expect if there's anybody there in Marblehead who comes from Pilipits, you will write to me, please. You know, you can't make that much sense of the world, and you don't have the wherewithal to worship the way that the formulaic Judaism dictates. So what do? You believe the Baba Meisters. You believe what your mother taught you, and your mother taught you what our mother taught her. And my mother learned, for example, and I took it in, because if you lose your mother at 15, you don't really expect that it's going to happen, and you don't store up enough memories. It happened relatively fast. One of the secrets in my family was that my mother was dying. I wasn't told until it was too late for me to have conversations with her, because she was already on morphine, and I simply missed that opportunity because I was being protected from this. But in any case, what did I have? I had memories of the superstitions. I knew that you had to chew a thread if you were something was being mended while you were still in it. And I was an inquisitive little kid, so I said, why do I have to chew a thread? It seems ridiculous. It has nothing to do with the hole in my sleeve. And my mother would say, because the only thing that you should be sewn into is your shroud. And if you're getting sewn into this, the ayin hara, the evil eye, kenahara is kain ayin hara, will think that you're dead and take you, or think you're dying and take you. That was also why I could not sleep with the moon shining in on me, because the moon is only supposed to shine on your grave. And if the moon shines in on you, it will attract the evil eye, which is all, the evil eye wants to blow your life to smithereens and claim you away from good things and God. That was her belief. That's how she ordered the universe. And I came to treasure these folk beliefs because they were so vivid. They were such a vivid part of her. No, don't take a picture of that woman. She's pregnant. It's not good luck. You can't anticipate God's will. You can't furnish a baby's room until the baby is actually there and healthy, because you anticipate God, and that's hubris, and that brings the devil, and that, you can't do that. So many things you couldn't do, and things you had to do. You had to have a loaf of bread and salt in a new house. My children have added wine. When they move, they'll be sitting amongst boxes and they'll have a loaf of bread and salt and wine. But I passed them, my mother's superstitions, to my children, because there was no other way to connect them to my mother. I wanted something vivid that would allow them to remember the woman they never knew, who molded me in so many ways. And I'll just add part of my story by saying that when my son was 18, my husband and I went to the symphony, and I was sitting there and realized all of a sudden that we were having our house painted, and therefore the blinds were not up. And we were going to go out to dinner after the symphony, and it would be so late by the time we got back that maybe our son would go to sleep with the moon shining in on him. So after we left our dinner partners, it was like 11 o'clock at night. We come home and I run upstairs. My son is in his bedroom. And mind you, he's 18 and he has packed up a bed sheet.
Wow.
And that's when I knew my mother was in his life.
Right. Well, and one of your stories that just broke my heart, because my mom passed away a couple of years ago, and I know what that deformed tablespoon, you know, the tin thing, what those mean to me, having those. And you don't, you know, you have these superstitions, but you don't have that yellowware that you used to lick the chocolate frosting out of, because your dad gave all that stuff away. And so, you know, I'm glad that you have the superstitions and that they've kind of, you know, taken that place, but I feel your pain with that.
It's so true. You don't want to be materialistic.
Right.
Things are meaningless compared to people, but when you're around people, things are very meaningful and they evoke the person.
I mean, I even wrote down what you wrote, which is when people aren't around anymore, all we have left to remember them, besides endearing stories and enduring love, are the things they held in their hands, used in their lives, and cherished. That's just beautiful. So before I tear up too much, let's take an audience question, a little more serious. Can you tell us about your work with the International Center for Peace in the Middle East?
Yes, but that organization, unfortunately, is defunct. It was founded by Rita Hauser, who is a very well-known Republican lawyer, and who was a very brave peace seeker when it wasn't being done, when the PLO was still off limits and, people couldn't have dialogues. And she felt it very important to start breaking down barriers, because someday peace had to be made, and it wasn't going to be made only by the top down, by the negotiators and the leaders. It had to come from the bottom up. And so I became part of that group, and it mattered a lot to me. And when it became defunct for a whole lot of unrelated reasons, I got very active in Americans for Peace Now, and I've been involved with them for 35 years. And it's a liberal, a Zionist, pro-Israel, pro-peace organization that keeps the issue alive and that educates people around the country on what's really going on the ground, on settlement activity and erosions of democracy and things that really, to me, are deeply worrisome. So that's one of my passions. Is I have just a few really big passions in my life. Feminism, Jewish feminism, Israel-Palestinian peacemaking, and just a sense of, what's happening in the world about the erosions of democracy everywhere. It so frightens me.
Yeah. Well, what brought you back to Judaism after you left it and then found feminism and melding?
Yeah, it's an interesting story because it's a commentary on necessity being the mother of invention. As I said, I was alienated from Judaism and estranged. I only went to synagogue. I was a very pious little girl. My father was a big shot. He was the president of everything you could be the president of. He went to meetings every night. My parents devoted themselves to supporting, the Yeshuv to become a state. And when Israel became a state, building a kind of community of support for the IDF and for Hadassah Hospital and all of that. So I felt, very, where did I just lose myself? God, you're 83, you lose yourself. Tell me where I started.
To come right back to the
how I came back.
how you found your way back.
How I found my way back. Okay. So as I said, necessity being the mother of invention. Thank you, Shelley. My husband and I and our family spent summers on Fire Island until about 10 years ago. And Fire Island is a very long spit outside of Long Island, outside of New York. And a group of men were sitting around on the beach and said to each other at the end of summer, wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to go back into the city, brave the traffic and the heat, and go to shul? Can't we? What if we made a Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah service here, and we could set up chairs on someone's deck, and we'll take a picnic table and put an orange grate on it and cover it with very nice, Shabbat cloths, and we'll borrow, bring in all the yarmulkes from the Shorts wedding and the Shapiro bar mitzvah that we all have in our drawers. And we'll make a little ad hoc, service out here. And they're making all the plan. They're saying somebody's going to go to the one store that was out there in Fire Island, tiny little store, and ask if they would donate, honey cake and Manischewitz wine to this little Jewish conclave of ours. And then I realized that, I'm listening to all this. This is 1970. Remember, I left in 1955 when my mother died. This is 1970. I have 3 kids already. And they're saying to each other, well, who's going to run the service? And one says to the other, well, I haven't done, all I know is my bar mitzvah Haftorah, my bar mitzvah Parsha. I don't remember Hebrew. I can't follow. I can't. And I just, sitting off to the side there, said, I'll do it. They said, you'll do it. I said, yeah, I can do it. I had sat on my father's lap from the time I was 3 when he was president of the shul, and I was at every Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and Shabbat service and Purim service that there ever was. So I could do it. And so I sat down with the volunteer firemen who volunteered to be the rabbi, and I became the Chazanit, the cantor. And we made a machzor, a little, a holiday prayer book out of mimeographed it. And, I knew what you had to have. You had to have a Avinu Malkeinu, you had to have Unatan Tokef. You had to have things that were going to make what the high holy days a real service. And well, it had been a restricted community till 1966. And we moved there in 68, and this was 70. And so we didn't know how many Jews were going to turn up in this, somebody's backyard on their deck. And lo and behold, about, 30 adults and loads of children came out of the woodwork and attended the service. And it was just a great feeling. And I was happy to be back. I was taking ownership of my own faith, which I'd been barred from by my father, the gatekeeper, and all the men who were gatekeepers. And that was the beginning of my trip back. Wow. I did that for 13 years. I ran that service, the Hebrew part of the service.
How ironic that came full circle from not counting to leading.
Yeah, to leading.
Yeah.
I happen to be a believer, so after doing the Rosh Hashanah service, my little group of the guys and I said, wouldn't it be great if we did, Kol Nidre and Yom Kippur also, because, people, why should they go back to the city when they didn't have to for Rosh Hashanah? And so I thought to myself, because this was the first, I thought to myself, I don't have the nerve. I don't have the chutzpah to chant Kol Nidre. To me, that's like, gives me goosebumps. And it, as I said, I was a very observant kid and I couldn't chant it. How could I? And I went for a walk along the bay, which is on one side where the sun sets. And I really asked for a sign. And you're not going to believe it, but I got
a bush didn't burn.
I got a purple sunset. I got a purple sunset. It was purple and shimmering. And I said, okay, I'll do it. And let me say, if I hadn't done it, they would have done Kol Nidre in English. And I just don't think it had the power.
No.
And I did it, and the world didn't come to an end. It was 1970 before any women rabbis existed, before Ms. Magazine, before women had an were allowed to have an aliyah, before there were Saturday bat mitzvahs for girls. I had Friday night. We had sponge cake and manischewitz. We did not have, a party at the plaza. So it was a different world then, and it was really quite astonishing that that was my way back.
Wow.
In other words, I left because of a feminist reason in 1955. I never would have given it that vocabulary. And I came back because of feminism, because I decided that I was equal to this.
Well, you mentioned Ms. Magazine, and that is one of the questions from the audience. How did you meet up with Gloria Steinem? And can you talk just a little bit, as much as you would like, about founding Ms. Magazine? I know that's a total other.
It's a total other.
Yeah.
And there are no secrets or shame associated with it. But I'll just say that I went to Washington to help found the National Women's Political Caucus in July of 1971 at the invitation of Betty Friedan, who had read my first book, How to Make It in a Man's World. When I was there, I had the opportunity to meet Gloria because I was going into a room to write up the plenary session and the statement of purpose after, which is what we used to do in those days, have conferences, write up our proposals and create a statement of purpose that was going to establish a new agenda. And in this case, it was to get both parties to take seriously women's issues and to put them front and center on their platforms and have candidates speak to them as they ran for office. And so I went into this little side room, big hotels have like a ballroom in which the plenaries happen, and then you go into the little workshop rooms. And I opened the door because I was going to write this up, and which I was tasked to do. And who's sitting in that room all by herself but Gloria Steinem. And it was, for me, I was a baby feminist in 1971. I mean, brand new to all the epiphanies that happened to women when we suddenly realized, things don't have to be the way they were. We don't have to put up with this. And of course, I was awed by her. And I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought I was told to go in here into this room and write, because I have to write this up." She said, "Well, I'm writing up another plenary. Why don't we work together?" Which is the essence of Gloria Steinem. There's nobody I've ever met who has less ego and more generosity than Gloria. And she just kind of took me, she must have seen I was terrified of her. And she just made it like such an ordinary thing that we would work together, And we did. We worked together until 3 a.m. And this was at the Shoreham Hotel, and it was so hyper air conditioned that we were and it was summer, it was July in 71, and we were freezing. And so we took those felt tablecloths off the tables that are in those meeting rooms. We wrapped ourselves up in the green felt tablecloths, and we became very, very close, very fast from the experience. And she said, "When we get back to New York, would you like to join this small group that's starting to talk about a magazine for women, run by women, edited by women, everything by women, for women?" And I said, "No question about it." Count me in, and that's what happened. And she and I were just on the stage of the Stryker Center last week in New York City, before an audience of about 600 people watching and about 9,000 people on Zoom, just talking about our 50-year friendship, as well as the book, talking about our mother. It was really quite
beautiful. I watched it, and just for the audience out there, it is available. It was recorded, and you can watch that.
Yeah, it's at the Stryker Center.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Here's another question from the audience. You found out at the age of 12, and you've written about the Winthrop Days, I believe 3 times.
Right.
that your parents had been divorced from other spouses, and that your sister was actually your half sister. And in fact, there was another half sister. And the question is, how did that affect you? I would add on to that also. Did you ever wish that you had never found out? Since you write that, you know, your life has kind of been burdened with this betrayal since that. You in fact wrote, betrayal became my burden, gullibility my shame. Those are very
That's how I felt, because
weighty words.
I mean, to discover that your parents are liars and that they created a charade of a life to cover up the simple fact that they had each been divorced, and that my sister, who I grew up with, who was 14 years older than I, Betty, that she was my mother's daughter, not my father's daughter, and that my father had a daughter who he had abandoned when he married my mother. To discover all that, and that all my relatives were in on it, because they had to be in on it, because my parents lied about everything. Their marriage date, for example, when they were married, when I thought they were married for 25 years, they had to backdate their marriage to cover the fact that my sister was 14 years older than I. They were really married in 37. I was born in 39. My sister was born in 1925. They had to say they were married in 1923 to cover for my father to be her biological father. And here I was, you know, I did the math, and I was celebrating their 25th wedding, their silver wedding anniversary. I made all kinds of things for them to celebrate. And I invited my aunt come from the Bronx, and we went next door to my aunt who lived next door, and we just made a big family thing of it. And it was all a fake. My parents had been married for 11 years at that point. So to discover that everything was a house of cards, and that they would lie to me rather than just tell me. I was already 12, you know. I couldn't really trust the adult world from then on. It just took the rug out from under me, and I could never look at them the same. But I wouldn't wish ignorance on myself, because I was glad I met my secret sister. Talk about a secret. I mean, imagine hiding a daughter for 12 years from her half sister, which was my father's daughter. I'm glad I met her. I'm sad about how it worked out with her, because she was so resentful and hostile for good reason. I mean, you don't get abandoned and forget about it when you finally, you know, get back with your father. And it was extremely painful, but also very, very satisfying when I was a teenager to find out I had another sister, and to find out she was so fascinating. I write about her. She was fascinated and tortured. She was incredibly brilliant. She had 180 IQ. She had a PhD. She was the world's leading authority on this gypsy culture that became her doctorate. And she became a role model for me of a different sort. My other sister, Betty, was like Good Housekeeping square. She made beautiful dinners, and she made a beautiful house, and she made curtains, and she had 4 children. Rena was, you know, completely off the wall compared to Betty. And it was useful, I think, to my growing up to see varieties of womanhood I had never even imagined. I mean, she was friends with Ruth Benedict, who was as famous as Margaret Mead in anthropology. And she was a gypsy princess. She had been adopted by this tribe, and she took me with her. It was fascinating, you know. By the time I met her, I was 14. And, you know, she left a very big impression on me. It did not end well, though.
Yeah.
There was too much anger. And
Well,
you could read all about it.
yes, and well, you should. One last question. I see I have time for just one more. Again, from the audience, what happened to the documents? Who has all the letters? Are they back safely in the secret door?
They are right here. They came out of the shopping bag in the shape they had gone in. And, you know, they were crinkled pieces of paper and they were airmail and they were envelopes with 3-cent stamps on them, you know, from the 30s and 40s. And they're all spread out now and in very, I'm pointing over here, spread out and very neat and very right over there. And
Yeah.
in their own files. And I write about my mother's deathbed note to me, and that's up there.
Really? Wow.
Right there, always
Yeah.
near.
Yeah.
And I wrote about her deathbed note to my sister, which I discovered in the shopping bag. Thank God, because it explains so much about my mother's shame. I mean, she admitted, she says in that heartbreaking letter, I lied because the truth was too painful to bear. And she admits that between the time she was divorced until she met my father, she masqueraded as a single woman. She sent my sister to boarding school and she pretended to be she never talked about her divorce and she never told her friends that she had a daughter. She was too ashamed. So when she and my father moved to Queens and made a whole new life, that's when they started to create the lies about who they were. They had to clean up their act. They had to get rid of all the shameful stuff that they had done to pass
Yeah.
as perfect the way you were supposed to, they thought. It's an
Well,
amazing thing that what that generation had to do.
it
Yeah.
is, or that they felt they had to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
Anyway, thank you for those very thoughtful questions.
So richly describe this, taking us right there. Thank you, Letty Cottin Pogrebin, for joining us virtually tonight. I do want to put in a little plug. Please go, and no one asked me to do this, go to lettycottinpogrebin.com to find out a lot more about the depth of this author and all the different subjects that she lectures on. You can sign up for her newsletter, which I did today. Some of the different topics that she is just as brilliant in as her memoir Shanda include Getting Over Getting Older. Love that one. Jewish Continuity into the 21st Century, Feminism and Faith, Two Jewish Journeys, which are conversations with her daughter Abigail, Interfaith and Ethnic Dialogue, Encountering the Other. There are just many layers to peel in this wonderful. So please support all of our authors by buying their books. If you are in person, you can buy a pre-signed copy after the event here. And if you're at home, go to jccns.org and click on Copper Dog Books. Next up, please join us in person at the JCC next Thursday, October 27th at 7 o'clock to hear local author Eric J. Dolan discuss his latest book, Rebels at Sea, Privateering in the American Revolution. And once again, it was a real honor. Letty Cottin Pogrebin, please check out her book, Shanda. And
Thank you, Shelley. I must say I lucked out with you as an interviewer. Your questions were so thoughtful and beautifully posed. I appreciate that.
Thank you, and totally back at you. Okay, I'm trusting that this will go into cyberspace.